Today, we're counting down 13 weird facts you didn't know about Hogan's Heroes. Picture this. You're in Stalag 13, a World War II prisoner of war camp run by the most incompetent Germans in television history, and somehow, it's the funniest place on Earth. Hogan's Heroes debuted on CBS in September 1965 and ran for 6 glorious seasons, 168 episodes of tunnel digging, bumbling guards, and Colonel Hogan outsmarting everyone in the room with a grin on his face. But behind all that comedy gold, there are casting surprises, dark personal histories, network close calls, and secrets hidden in plain sight. So let's get into it. Number 13. The network almost killed it before it started. Here's something that'll make your jaw drop. Hogan's Heroes almost didn't happen. Not because of bad writing or weak casting, but because CBS executives were genuinely terrified of the premise. A comedy set in a Nazi prisoner of war camp in 1965? When millions of people had lived through World War II, network brass were convinced it was career suicide. Several executives pushed back hard, worried about public backlash and advertiser pullout. Creator Bernard Fine and producer Edward Feldman had to fight tooth and nail just to get the pilot greenlit. What convinced CBS in the end was a simple argument. The Nazis weren't the heroes. The prisoners were. The comedy came from watching the enemy get outwitted every single week. Once that clicked, the doors opened. It's wild to think that a little reframing saved one of the most beloved sitcoms of its era. The roles were played by actual Holocaust survivors, but this one hits differently when you really sit with it. 3 of the main cast members, Werner Klemperer, John Banner, and Leon Askin, were Jewish actors who had personally fled Nazi persecution in Europe. Werner Klemperer, who played the ridiculous Colonel Klink, was born in Cologne, Germany, and escaped with his family in 1935. John Banner, the beloved Sergeant Schultz, was Austrian and lost family members in the Holocaust. Leon Askin, who played General Burkhalter, survived a French internment camp before making it to America. These men weren't just playing against a dark chapter of history, they had lived inside it, and they chose comedy as their response. There's something quietly profound and even defiant about it. Every time Schultz said, "I see nothing," there was a real human being underneath, laughing last. Number 11. Werner Klemperer had one non-negotiable condition. Werner Klemperer was a classically trained Emmy Award-winning actor who took his craft extremely seriously. So when he agreed to play Colonel Wilhelm Klink, he didn't just sign a contract and show up. He laid down a very specific condition, and he meant every word of it. Klemperer told the producers that he would only play the role if Klink was always the fool. Klink could never win. He could never outsmart Hogan. He could never be portrayed as genuinely competent or threatening. The character had to be a buffoon, start to finish, every episode. No exceptions. The producers agreed, and honestly, that condition became the engine of the entire show. Klemperer went on to win 2 Emmy Awards for the role. The man who demanded to play the fool turned out to be one of the smartest people in the room. Number 10. Bob Crane was almost not Hogan before Bob Crane became the face of Colonel Robert Hogan. Charming, quick-witted, perpetually scheming, the role came surprisingly close to going to someone else entirely. The producers had considered a few other actors during the casting process, and there was genuine momentum behind a different direction for the lead. Crane himself was primarily known at the time as a radio personality and comedian, not a leading man in a primetime network series. He was doing well on radio in Los Angeles, but network television stardom was a different animal entirely. What sealed the deal was his screen test energy, that effortless, wisecracking confidence that made you believe this guy could talk his way out of anything. It wasn't just likability, it was command. Once Crane walked in with that quality, the search was essentially over. The role fit him like a tailored uniform. Number 9. Schultz's catchphrase was never in the script.
I know nothing, I see nothing, I say nothing.
If you grew up watching this show, those words are probably already playing in your head in John Banner's warm, bumbling voice. But here's the thing. That iconic catchphrase wasn't handed to Banner by the writers. It evolved organically on set, shaped by Banner's instincts and his own deeply personal understanding of the character. Banner had a theory about Schultz that he talked about in interviews. Schultz wasn't stupid. He was wise. He knew exactly what Hogan and the prisoners were doing. He just chose not to see it, because getting involved meant responsibility, and responsibility meant trouble. That philosophical layer gave the catchphrase its real weight. It wasn't comedy padding, it was a character philosophy, and audiences felt that without even being able to articulate why. Banner turned a running gag into something almost poignant. Number 8. The show had a secret anti-Nazi agenda baked right in. On the surface, Hogan's Heroes looked like pure escapist comedy. Bumbling guards, clever prisoners, and a lot of tunnel jokes. But several of the people making the show had a very deliberate point of view they were weaving into every episode. The Jewish cast members, the writers and producer Edward Feldman, were keenly aware that they were portraying Nazi officers as idiots, not monsters, not feared authorities, idiots. And that was entirely intentional. There's a long tradition in Jewish humor of deflating the powerful through mockery, and Hogan's Heroes leaned into that tradition with both arms. By making Klink a coward and Schultz a pretender, the show was making an ideological argument through comedy. These people weren't gods. They weren't a master race. They were clowns in uniforms. It's subtle, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. Number 7, The Real Stalag 17, was the blueprint. Now, if you're a classic film fan, the name Stalag might ring another bell entirely. Hogan's Heroes drew significant inspiration from the 1953 Billy Wilder film Stalag 17, a dramatic story set in a World War II POW camp with a much darker tone. Actually asked, what if you took that premise and flipped it completely into comedy? The tunnels, the scheming prisoners, the oblivious guards, the DNA is right there. But here's where it gets complicated. The writers of Stalag 17, Donald Bevan and Edmund Trzcinski, actually sued the producers of Hogan's Heroes, claiming the show lifted their concept without credit or compensation. The case was eventually settled out of court. So the very foundation of one of TV's most beloved comedies came with a legal footnote. Billy Wilder's shadow stretched longer than anyone expected. Number 6. The theme song was originally written with lyrics, "You know the theme. Everyone knows the theme. That bouncy, brass-heavy march that somehow sounds both military and completely ridiculous at the same time. What most people don't know is that composer Jerry Fielding originally wrote the Hogan's Heroes theme with a full set of lyrics attached. Yes, actual words, meant to be sung. The vocal version was considered during production, but the decision was eventually made to go purely instrumental. And that turned out to be a masterstroke. The wordless march had a universality to it. You didn't need to understand English to know this show was fun. The tune became one of the most recognizable in television history, whistled and hummed by kids who'd never even seen an episode. Fielding was nominated for an Emmy for the composition. Sometimes the best creative decision is the one where you take something away. Number 5, Richard Dawson went from Stalag 13 to game show legend. If the name Newkirk rings a bell, you're in good company. Richard Dawson played Corporal Peter Newkirk, the British charmer of the group, for all 6 seasons of Hogan's Heroes. But what Dawson did after Stalag 13 is one of the great career pivots in entertainment history. He became the original host of Family Feud, premiering in 1976, and turned it into a cultural phenomenon. His warm, disarming style with contestants, the same energy he brought to Newkirk, translated perfectly to daytime game show television. He became famous for kissing the women contestants on the cheek, a habit that somehow worked entirely because of his genuinely affectionate personality. From a Nazi POW camp to Survey Says, not many careers make that particular journey. Dawson proved that charm, deployed consistently, is a career-long superpower. Number 4, the show was canceled, but not because of ratings. Here's something that surprises almost everyone who hears it. When CBS canceled Hogan's Heroes in 1971 after 6 seasons, it wasn't because the show was struggling in the ratings. Far from it. The series was actually still pulling a solid audience when the plug was pulled. What happened was part of a much bigger programming earthquake known as the Rural Purge. A sweeping decision by CBS in 1971 to cancel a large block of shows that, while popular, skewed toward older and rural audiences. Network executives were chasing younger, urban demographics, and advertiser dollars followed that chase. Hogan's Heroes got swept out in the same wave as Green Acres, the Beverly Hillbillies, and others. It's one of the stranger moments in television history. A network essentially canceling success because success was wearing the wrong demographic hat. The prisoners finally ran out of tunnels, not laughs. Number 3, Bob Crane's life after Hogan ended in tragedy. This is the one fact on the list that carries real weight, and it deserves to be treated with care. After Hogan's Heroes ended, Bob Crane found it difficult to recapture that level of success. He worked steadily in dinner theater and occasional television, but the iconic role had, in some ways, defined a ceiling as much as a peak. In 1978, Bob Crane was found murdered in his apartment in Scottsdale, Arizona. The case was never officially solved, and it became one of Hollywood's most haunting, unsolved mysteries. A suspect was tried decades later, but acquitted. The 2002 film Autofocus explored Crane's later life and the circumstances around his death. For anyone who grew up laughing with Colonel Hogan every week, learning the real story is a genuine gut punch. Behind the grin and the charm, there was a far more complicated and ultimately tragic human story. Colonel Klink was almost cut after the pilot. Werner Klemperer's Emmy-winning fan-beloved Colonel Klink almost never made it past the first episode. In early discussions about the series format, there were producers and network voices who felt the show didn't need a recurring German commander, that the comedy could function with rotating antagonists rather than a fixed buffoon at the top, variety, and keeping things fresh. What those voices underestimated was the power of a consistent comedic relationship. The dynamic between Hogan's confident genius and Klink's fragile incompetence wasn't just a joke. It was the spine of the whole show. Every episode lived inside that tension. Once Klemperer started filming and it became clear what he was doing with the character, the conversation about cutting him evaporated entirely. Sometimes the thing someone wants to remove turns out to be the thing that holds everything together. Number 1. The cast's real wartime histories mirror the fiction more than anyone realized. Save the best for last, or in this case, the most layered. When you step back and look at the full cast of Hogan's Heroes, what you find is something almost surreal in its symmetry. The actors playing the prisoners, the heroes, the good guys, included men who had genuinely fled Nazi oppression. Werner Klemperer, John Banner, Leon Askin, and Robert Clary, who played Corporal LeBeau and was himself a Holocaust survivor who had been tattooed with a camp number, were on the winning side of the screen. Meanwhile, several of the actors playing the supposedly menacing German guards had no particular connection to that world at all. Robert Clary lost over a dozen family members in the Holocaust. He survived Buchenwald, and then he spent 6 years making America laugh in a comedy set in a camp, like the ones that had nearly killed him. If that isn't the most complicated, extraordinary, quietly heroic thing a performer has ever done with a television role, I honestly don't know what is. And that's our tour of Stalag 13. Every tunnel, every secret radio, every glorious I see nothing. So tell me, which fact hit you the hardest? Drop it in the comments, and we'll see you back here on Memory Lane real soon. Until then, keep your tunnels dug and your clink confused.